$2,300,000, 47 properties, 3 hotels, hundreds of lives changed. But numbers cannot tell you what it cost her to build that empire, or who she really was before Sacramento turned her into a legend. Before we continue, if you enjoy deep dives into the Wild West, make sure you click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more shocking stories tomorrow. Also, please leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Now, let's continue with the story. The estate inventory took 4 months to complete. 237 pages of documented wealth. Every property deed, every business interest, every bank account. The lawyers worked through summer 1895, cataloging what she left behind, and the numbers were staggering. But they couldn't catalog what wasn't there. No children to inherit her fortune, no husband to mourn at her funeral, no family gathered at her bedside when pneumonia took her at 43 years old. Just a paid nurse, 3 lawyers waiting to read her will, and the hollow silence of a woman who died surrounded by everything except the people she might have loved. The Sacramento Union published her obituary on June 9, 1895. It focused on her business achievements, her properties, her reputation as the merchant queen of K Street. The article mentioned her charitable nature and her support of women's causes. What it didn't mention was that she died alone, in a house too large for one person, in a bed she'd probably slept in by herself for the last 11 years. History wants to celebrate Clara Hartwell as a triumph. Look at what this mail-order bride achieved. Look at the empire she built from nothing. And yes, the achievements deserve recognition. The documents prove she accomplished something extraordinary for a woman of her era. But documents are cold things. They record transactions, not feelings. They preserve property deeds, not regrets. When Clara's will was read to the assembled lawyers and city officials, it revealed something the business records never could. She left her entire fortune to 23 different beneficiaries. Every single one was either a woman she'd helped in business or a women's educational organization. Not one distant relative back east. Not one male business associate. Not one traditional charity. Every dollar she'd accumulated over 19 years went to lifting other women. That will wasn't just a legal document. It was a statement. It was Clara saying something she'd maybe never said out loud during her life. I built this alone. I suffered alone. I succeeded alone. But I refuse to let that loneliness be meaningless. The question historians argue about isn't whether Clara succeeded. The documents prove that beyond doubt. The question is whether her success was worth what she gave up to achieve it. She arrived in Sacramento at 24 with $3 and a marriage. Arrangement with a stranger. She died at 43 owning more property than any woman west of the Mississippi. But she died alone. Was the trade worth it? We can't ask Clara. We can only look at the choices she made and try to understand the woman behind the numbers. To do that, we have to go back to the beginning. Back to Boston, 1876. Back to a young seamstress who made a decision that would define every day of the 19 years she had left. The documents tell us what she built. The story behind them tells us what it cost. Boston, 1876. Clara worked in a cramped room above a millinery shop, sewing dresses for women who would never speak to her on the street. The census records list her occupation as seamstress. Her weekly wage as $3.20. Those numbers defined the walls of her entire world. She wasn't poor by working-class standards. She had a room, she had work, she could read and write, which separated her from many women in her position. 6 years of formal schooling gave her abilities most working-class girls never received. She could calculate profit margins in her head. She could read contracts and spot deceptive language. She could manage complex accounts. None of it mattered in Boston. Her parents had died within months of each other when she was 22. Consumption took her mother in January 1874. Her father followed in April, heart giving out from grief or exhaustion, or both. They left her nothing but the education they'd scraped together, and a headstone she visited every Sunday. By 24, Clara understood her future with perfect clarity. She would sew until her eyesight failed, probably around 40. Then she would depend on charity or starve. Marriage might offer escape, but Boston men in her social class wanted wives who could cook and clean, not wives who could read account ledgers. Her education made her unmarriageable in the world she inhabited. The matrimonial advertisements started appearing in Boston. Newspapers around 1875. Western men seeking capable women. The language was always careful. Business arrangements, practical partnerships, no romantic promises. Clara read them with growing fascination, not because she believed in frontier romance, but because the ads were honest about what they offered. One advertisement caught her attention in February 1876. Sacramento boarding house operator seeking educated woman to manage accounts and daily operations. Half share of profits. Must be literate and willing to relocate. The ad appeared in the Boston Globe on February the 3rd. Clara spent 2 weeks researching Sacramento. She read everything she could find about California property laws. The 1872 Married Women's Property Act meant wives could own assets independently. They could enter contracts. They could control their own earnings, rights that didn't exist in Massachusetts. She wrote her response on February 18th. Not a love letter, a business proposal. She detailed her skills managing the seamstress shop's accounts, her literacy, her organizational abilities. She asked specific questions about the boarding house revenues, occupancy rates, and current debt situation. Edward Hartwell's response arrived 3 weeks later with a single page of figures showing steady profits. Clara examined those numbers carefully. They looked solid, sustainable. She had no way of knowing they were fiction. On March 10th, 1876, Clara Hartwell boarded a train west carrying one trunk, $3.40, and the calculated hope that California offered something Boston never would. Not love, not rescue, just possibility. She was trading everything familiar for a marriage to a stranger and a business she'd never seen. The gamble was enormous, but staying in Boston meant dying slowly over decades of sowing other women's futures while watching her own eyesight dim. Clara chose the gamble. That choice would define everything that followed. The SS Oregon docked in Sacramento on March 14th, 1870. Edward Hartwell met her with a wagon and an apology he hadn't earned the right to make yet. He was 41 years old, weathered from mining work, barely literate, and clearly nervous. Clara was 24, exhausted from 3 weeks of travel, and about to discover she'd been lied to. The boarding house had 12 rooms as advertised. 3 had roof damage from winter rains. 2 were occupied by miners who hadn't paid rent in 6 weeks. The kitchen stove was broken. The whole place smelled of neglect and desperation. Edward showed her around with increasing discomfort, finally admitting the business was struggling. Struggling was generous. The building owed $400 to the Merchants Bank, with foreclosure scheduled for April 30th. 6 weeks away. That first night, Clara sat alone in what was supposed to be their bedroom, holding Edward's real account books. Not the fabricated page he'd sent to Boston, but the actual records of a failing operation. The numbers told a brutal story. Underpriced rooms, massive food losses, supplier contracts that were bleeding him dry. Edward couldn't read well enough to catch the mathematical errors in his own invoices. California law would have supported her divorce claim. Fraud. Misrepresentation. She had his letter promising a profitable business, and his actual books proving otherwise. She could leave on the next steamship. Clara spent that night doing something that would become her pattern for the next 19 years. She calculated, not just the numbers in the ledgers, but the cost of every choice available to her. Leaving meant returning to Boston with even less than she'd left with. Her seamstress position was already filled. Her reputation would be damaged by a failed Western marriage. She'd be 24 and desperate in a city that had already offered her nothing. Staying meant betting everything on her ability to fix what Edward had broken. It meant a marriage to a man she didn't love, and who clearly didn't love her. It meant brutal work and enormous risk. But it also meant control. California law gave her rights she'd never have in Boston, and Edward's failure meant opportunity. Around 2 a.m, Clara made Edward an offer. She would save the boarding house from foreclosure, but from that moment forward, she controlled every business decision. He would work his mining claims. She would run the operation. He agreed because he was weeks from losing everything, and she was his only option. Neither of them understood what Clara had just unleashed. Edward thought he was getting temporary help. Clara knew she was seizing the only chance she'd ever have to build something beyond the narrow life Boston had sentenced her to. The deception that brought her to Sacramento was Edward's, but the calculation that kept her there was entirely her own. That first night, sitting in a cold boarding house holding the evidence of Edward's lies, Clara Hartwell made the choice that would define everything. She chose power over safety. She chose building over belonging. She would spend the rest of her life living with that decision. The first year nearly killed her. Not physically, though the work was brutal. Emotionally. The grinding reality of 16-hour days with no one to share the burden. Clara's business ledgers from 1876 and 1877 preserve the financial transformation. Revenue doubled, costs dropped. Profit margins emerged where losses had existed. What the ledgers don't record is what those numbers cost. The exhaustion, the isolation, the slow death of any hope for a normal marriage. She woke before dawn to prepare breakfast for 12 tenants. Managed accounts until noon, negotiated with suppliers who resented dealing with a woman, cleaned rooms, planned meals, kept books by lamplight until midnight. Then started again the next day. Edward was rarely present. He preferred his mining camps in the foothills to a wife who made him feel inadequate every time she corrected his arithmetic or renegotiated a contract he'd bungled. By late 1877, they were married only in the legal sense. He sent money when his claims produced. She sent him brief updates about the business. They avoided each other when he visited Sacramento. The loneliness was crushing in ways Clara hadn't anticipated. She'd expected hard work. She'd expected business challenges. She hadn't expected the complete isolation that came from being smarter than everyone around you and unable to hide it. The miners who rented rooms treated her with wary respect. They paid on time because she kept meticulous records and enforced contracts ruthlessly. But they didn't talk to her beyond necessary business. She was their landlord, not their friend. The suppliers she'd forced to lower prices hated her. They complied because she'd caught them cheating and threatened to take her business elsewhere. But every negotiation meant enduring condescension from men who thought women couldn't understand numbers. Other women in Sacramento either envied her business success or pitied her loveless marriage. Neither group offered friendship. She was too successful to relate to working women, too working class to be accepted by Sacramento's emerging middle-class wives. Clara had one friend during those early years, her ledger book. Every night, she'd record the day's transactions with obsessive precision. The act of balancing accounts gave her something the human relationships in her life never did. Certainty, control, proof of her capability. By August 1877, the boarding house was generating $130 monthly profit. By November, she'd paid off the bank debt. By January 1878, she had $600 saved. The numbers proved her success. They also marked her increasing isolation. Success meant Clara worked while other women socialized. It meant understanding business in ways that made her unmarriageable to any man who might have offered companionship. That meant Edward drifted further away, unable to face the wife who'd saved his business by exposing his incompetence. The price of saving Edward's failure wasn't just exhaustion. It was the slow realization that Clara had traded any chance at human connection for the power to control her own fate. Every perfectly balanced ledger represented another night alone. Every successful month meant another step away from the kind of life other women had. Clara understood this. The ledgers suggest she understood it clearly. She kept building anyway. The fire started after midnight on April 3rd, 1880. Clara woke to shouting and orange light flooding through her window. By dawn, 16 blocks of Sacramento had burned. 2 of her properties were gone. 4 years of work reduced to ash. Witnesses later told the Sacramento Union that Clara stood in the street watching her buildings burn without crying. They marveled at her composure. What they couldn't see was what happened inside her as those flames consumed everything she'd built. She'd lost buildings before this moment. She'd survived Edward's deception and near bankruptcy. But this was different. This was random, uncontrollable. Fire didn't care about her ledgers or her careful planning or the sacrifices she'd made. It just destroyed. Most people would have broken. The insurance would cover losses, but rebuilding meant more debt, more risk, more years of exhausting work. Clara was 28 years old and had been working 16-hour days for 4 years. She could have sold her remaining properties, taken the insurance money, and lived comfortably without ever working that hard again. She went home that morning, pulled out her insurance policies and property deeds, and started planning her rebuild before the embers cooled. But something died in Clara that night along with her properties. Any remaining hope for a different life, any pretense that this was temporary. The fire forced her to admit what she'd been avoiding. She wasn't building a business until something better came along. She was building an empire because empire building was all she had. The construction contracts she signed in May 1880 weren't just about replacing what burned. They were about building bigger, better, more permanent. She'd realized something standing in that street, watching her life burn. If she was going to sacrifice everything for this work, it had better mean something beyond survival. Clara borrowed $18,000 to rebuild. It was the biggest gamble of her career, possible only because she'd established 5 years of documented success. The banks trusted her numbers. They trusted her capability. By 1880, Clara Hartwell had better credit than most male business owners in Sacramento. But the rebuild changed her. The new properties weren't just boarding houses. They were residential hotels designed for professional women. Respectable spaces, safe environments, places where working women could build lives beyond just survival. Clara was creating what she'd never had. A home. Not for herself, she'd given up on that. But for women who might avoid her mistakes. Women who might have both independence and community. Women who wouldn't have to choose between power and connection the way she had. The fire revealed Clara's true strength. Not the strength to survive disaster, though she had that. The strength to admit that her choices had cost her everything soft and human, and to keep building anyway. Not for herself anymore, for something bigger. When the rebuilt Hartwell houses opened in late 1880, they represented more than financial success. They represented Clara's acknowledgement that she'd sacrificed personal happiness for professional achievement, and her determination to make that sacrifice count for something beyond her own survival. By 1882, the Hartwell houses had become something Clara never intended. A family. The employment records preserved at UC Berkeley tell part of the story. Clara hired women exclusively: property managers, bookkeepers, housekeepers, cooks. She paid them wages comparable to what men earned, and created positions that gave working women genuine careers instead of just jobs. But the letters archived at the California Historical Society tell the deeper truth. Women wrote to Clara about more than business. They asked advice about difficult employers, about money troubles, about family problems. They signed their letters with affection she probably didn't know how to return. Clara became a mother figure to dozens of women despite never having children. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd given up traditional motherhood when she chose business over domestic life. Now she found herself raising women instead of daughters, mentoring careers instead of children. The tenant records show Clara knew everything about the women living in her properties: their jobs, their families, their struggles. When a schoolteacher fell ill, Clara paid her rent for 3 months. When a seamstress needed equipment to start her own business, Clara loaned her the money at rates lower than any bank offered. This wasn't charity. Clara kept meticulous records of every loan and every favor, but it was also more than business. It was Clara creating the support network she'd never had when she arrived in Sacramento at 24 with $3 and no one to turn to. The found family Clara built was both beautiful and heartbreaking. The women respected her, trusted her, even loved her in their way. But they also feared her. She was their landlord, their employer, their benefactor. Real friendship requires equality. Clara's success had lifted her too far above the women she most wanted to connect with. She could never just be Clara with them. She was always Mrs. Hartwell, the successful businesswoman, the landlord who could raise rents, or the employer who could terminate positions. The power that protected her also isolated her. A letter from 1883 shows this painful clearly. A young woman thanked Clara for helping her find employment, then added that she wished they could be proper friends instead of landlord and tenant. Clara's response, carefully preserved, acknowledged the sentiment but maintained professional distance. She couldn't afford vulnerability. Vulnerability meant weakness, and weakness meant losing everything she'd built. By 1884, Clara's properties housed over 200 women. She'd created an economic ecosystem where female success supported more female success. Women recommended each other for jobs, shared business contacts, built careers that would have been impossible without the network Clara facilitated. It was extraordinary. It was also profoundly lonely. Clara had built a family structure with herself at the center, but her position at the center meant she could never be part of it. She was the mother who provided everything except the closeness mothers and daughters share. The benefactor who enabled friendships she couldn't participate in. The architect of community who remained outside the community she'd created. She understood this. The letters suggest she felt it deeply. She kept building the network anyway. Edward Hartwell died on October the 12th, 1884, in a mining shaft collapse. The Nevada County Coroner's report lists the cause and confirms his identity. He was 41. Clara was 32. They'd been married 8 years and had barely lived together for 3 of them. Clara wore black for 6 months as Victorian society demanded. What society didn't demand, and what surprises historians examining her correspondence, is that she grieved. Not for the husband Edward never was. They'd never loved each other. Their marriage was a business arrangement that gave Clara legal protection and Edward a capable manager for his failing operation. Romance hadn't been part of the contract, but Clara grieved anyway, for the partnership that might have existed if circumstances were different, for the one person alive who remembered when she was just a scared 24-year-old stepping off a steamship, for the man who'd been inadequate as a husband, but who'd at least been present in her life, however distantly. Edward's death made Clara the last person who remembered her beginning. No one else in Sacramento knew the young woman who'd arrived with $3 and desperate hope. They only knew Mrs. Hartwell, the successful businesswoman. Edward's death severed her final connection to who she'd been before success defined her. The legal changes were immediate and liberating. As a widow, Clara needed no husband's signature on any document. She could enter contracts, secure loans, buy and sell property entirely in her own name. Within 3 weeks, she'd filed paperwork to operate under her own name and obtained new credit lines with 4 banks. But the freedom came with a price. Every independent signature reminded her she was completely alone. No one to discuss business decisions with. No one to share success with. The documents show rapid expansion after Edward's death. 8 properties by end of 1884. Commercial real estate ventures by 1886. What they don't show is the empty house she returned to every night. A business associate noted in his diary that Clara seemed more driven after Edward's death. He meant it as a compliment about her business acumen. He didn't understand he was documenting Clara's response to grief. She worked harder because work was all she had. Building empire filled the space where other people had relationships. By 1886, Clara owned more property than any woman west of the Mississippi. She employed over 30 people. She was respected throughout Sacramento's business community. She was also more isolated than she'd ever been. Edward's inadequacy had at least been company. His absence was just void. The widow's liberation everyone celebrated was real. Clara's business expansion proved it. But liberation and loneliness aren't opposites. They often coexist. Clara was freer than she'd ever been to build her empire. She was also more alone than she'd ever been in her life. She filled that aloneness the only way she knew how. She acquired more properties, helped more women, built more networks, created more structures to prevent other women from facing the isolation she couldn't escape. Success became Clara's companion. Her ledgers became her confidants. Her empire became the family she'd never have. And she kept building. By 1892, Clara controlled more wealth than she could spend in 10 lifetimes. 47 properties, annual income exceeding $45,000. Respect from every bank and business in Sacramento. Everything she'd worked for since stepping off that steamship 16 years earlier. It meant nothing on the nights she couldn't sleep. The California Historical Society preserves a letter Clara wrote in 1893 to a young woman seeking a business loan. The first half discusses terms and interest rates with typical precision. But then Clara's professional mask slips. She writes about the isolation of success, how wealth creates distance, how people treat you differently when you can hire or fire them, how she can't remember the last conversation she had that wasn't about business. She crossed out those paragraphs before sending the letter. The archive preserved both versions, the professional letter she sent and the honest one she couldn't. Clara's wealth had created a prison as secure as poverty ever was. Just different bars. She couldn't have casual friendships because everyone wanted something. Business advice, loans, job references, property access. People who approached her saw opportunity, not Clara. She couldn't trust romantic interest. The few men who expressed interest either resented her wealth and wanted to control it, or were attracted to her money rather than her. At 40, Clara understood she would never have the kind of partnership other women took for granted. Her success had made that impossible. She couldn't be vulnerable. Vulnerability meant showing weakness, and weakness meant losing everything she'd built. So Clara maintained perfect professional competence at all times, never admitting fatigue or doubt or loneliness. The mask became permanent. Her charitable work increased in those years. She started providing loans to women entrepreneurs, creating what business historians now recognize as an early venture capital fund focused on female business owners. Between 1891 and 1895, she backed 17 women starting businesses, from seamstress shops to printing operations. This wasn't generosity born from abundance. It was Clara trying to create meaning from the sacrifice she'd made. If she couldn't have connection herself, at least she could enable it for other women. If her wealth isolated her, at least it could prevent other women from facing the poverty that had driven her west. But backing other women's dreams highlighted what Clara had given up for her own. Every wedding she attended for women she'd helped reminded her of the marriage she'd never had. Every child born to her former employees reminded her of the family she'd traded for empire. Every friendship she witnessed between women in her network showed her the connections she couldn't have. Success wasn't supposed to feel this empty. That's what the business books and self-made millionaire stories never mentioned. You could win everything you fought for and still lose what mattered most. By 1893, Clara Hartwell had achieved something extraordinary for a woman of her era. She'd built a fortune through intelligence and ruthless efficiency. She'd helped hundreds of women build better lives. She'd created economic networks that would outlast her. She'd also created a life where success was her only companion and power her only comfort. The fortune that freed her from poverty had trapped her in isolation. Clara knew she was dying before the doctors confirmed it. Pneumonia in February 1895 should have been survivable for a healthy 43-year-old. But Clara wasn't healthy. 19 years of 16-hour workdays had weakened her in ways ledgers never recorded. She spent March and April settling her affairs with the same precision she'd applied to everything. Meeting with lawyers, dictating her will, ensuring every property transfer was documented correctly, making certain her fortune would go exactly where she intended. The will she created reveals more about Clara Hartwell than any business record ever could. 23 beneficiaries, not one distant relative, not one male business associate, not one traditional charity. Every dollar went to women. Women she'd mentored, women's educational organizations, women-owned businesses, women's causes. $600,000 to the Sacramento Female Collegiate Institute for Business Education for Women. 3 commercial properties to women entrepreneurs she'd backed, giving them ownership of the spaces they'd built businesses in. Cash bequests to 12 women who'd worked for her, enough to change their lives completely. The will wasn't just legal documentation, it was Clara's final statement. I built this empire. I decide its legacy, and I choose to lift other women because no one lifted me. Her final weeks were spent in the house she'd lived in alone for 11 years. No family at her bedside, no husband to hold her hand, just a paid nurse and lawyers waiting to execute her instructions. Some called it tragedy. Clara had made her choices consciously. The nurse's diary, preserved unexpectedly in a family archive, provides the only intimate glimpse of Clara's final days. She describes a woman who remained composed even facing death, who asked about her property's management even from her sickbed, who corrected legal documents with the same precision she'd applied to account ledgers 19 years earlier. But the nurse also noted something else. In her final week, Clara asked the nurse to read letters from women she'd helped, thanking her for business loans, for employment references, for the safe housing that made their careers possible, for the opportunities she'd created. Clara listened to those letters with tears running down her face, the only time the nurse saw her cry. On June 7, 1895, Clara Hartwell died in her own bed in her own house, alone except for the nurse. no children, no husband, no family. Just the documented evidence of a fortune she'd built from $3 and the will that would distribute that fortune to women she'd helped but couldn't call friends. The Sacramento Union published her obituary 2 days later. It praised her business acumen and charitable nature. It noted her properties and her support of women's causes. It called her an inspiration. What it didn't say was that Clara died alone at 43, because the choices that made her successful also made her isolated. That she'd traded connection for power, that she'd built an empire that helped hundreds while leaving her with no one who knew her as anything except Mrs. Hartwell. The documents tell us what Clara built. Only we can decide if the cost was worth it. For a century, history forgot Clara Hartwell. Male business magnates got statues and street names. Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins. Their legacies were preserved in institutions and monuments. Clara got a misspelled footnote in a 1934 county history book. One paragraph, wrong name. No biographical detail. Not because her achievements were less documented. The evidence sat in archives for decades. Property deeds in county records. Business licenses in city files. Estate documents at the state archives. Business ledgers at UC Berkeley. Newspaper articles on microfilm. All of it preserved, none of it examined. History wasn't looking for women like Clara. Historians studying the West wanted stories about gunslingers and cattle, barons and railroad expansion, masculine conquest, violent conflict. They weren't cross-referencing property records with census data to identify female property owners. They weren't asking questions that would have revealed Clara's story. This changed in the 1990s when social historians began systematically examining documents previous generations had ignored. They found Clara. They found hundreds like her. Women who built businesses, women who owned properties, women who succeeded through intelligence rather than marriage to wealthy men. Clara's story forces uncomfortable questions about success and sacrifice. She achieved something extraordinary. Built a $2 million empire from $3 and a marriage arrangement. Helped hundreds of women through employment, housing, and business loans. Created economic networks that outlasted her life. She also died alone at 43. No children, no husband, no family, no close friends. Just the hollow success of wealth without connection. Was it worth it? That's the question we can't answer because Clara isn't here to tell us. We only have the choices she made. She chose power over domestic happiness. She chose building over belonging. She chose legacy over love. And she made those choices consciously, repeatedly, for 19 years. What we owe Clara isn't judgment about whether her choices were right. We owe her recognition that she had agency, that she made calculated decisions about her life, that women throughout history have had ambition, capability, and the willingness to sacrifice for what they believed mattered. The tragedy isn't that Clara succeeded alone. The tragedy is that success and connection felt like opposing choices to her, that she believed she had to trade one for the other, that the society she lived in made those trades necessary. Modern women face different constraints but similar pressures. The balance between career and family, between ambition and relationship, between power and vulnerability. Clara's story doesn't provide answers. It provides acknowledgement that these tensions aren't new and the costs are real. The documents proving Clara's achievements were never hidden. They were just invisible to people not looking for women's stories. Her life teaches us that history preserves what happened. But historians choose what matters. For a century, Clara's empire didn't matter. Her sacrifice didn't matter. Her calculated choice to build rather than belong didn't matter. Now it does. The evidence was always there. We finally chose to see the woman behind the numbers. If Clara's journey made you feel something, prove that women's stories matter by hitting like and subscribe. Next week, we're bringing you the Black Midwife who delivered over 2,000 babies and saved an entire mining town during the 1889 smallpox epidemic. Her name was erased from every history book, but the birth records don't lie. Her story will restore your faith in humanity and break your heart at the same time.